Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, The Power of Education. My name is Tim Bulson. I have the honor of serving as the current president of the GVSU Alumni Association Board of Directors. And today, obviously, by the title, we'll be focusing on the power of education and what it means through the eyes of our three panelists, with topics that include liberal education, access to education, lifelong learning, and even some of the context of education in a COVID and online environment. Before I introduce our three panelists, I would remind you to introduce yourself in the chat box. Feel free to share your name, your graduation year, your degree, and perhaps most importantly, why this session is of interest to you. As we go through the hour, feel free to use the chat for any conversation or last second questions that you might have. Drop them in the chat Q&A box. We'll easily pass them on to the panelists. So with all that, I'd like to introduce each of our panelists. First, Dr. Craig Benjamin. He is a professor of history in the Myers Honors College. Craig was a professional musician for 25 years in his native Australia before gaining his PhD from Arcane University in Sydney and then taking up his academic career. He currently teaches two foundational interdisciplinary courses in honors, Big History and Focus on Asia. Craig's recent publications include Big History, Between Nothing and Everything, Cambridge World History, Volume 4, and Empires of Ancient Eurasia. The First Silk Roads Era is forthcoming. Professor Benjamin's current research focuses on ancient Eurasian globalizations, big history, and world history historiography. I hope I got that last word correct. Dr. Moira Ozais. Dr. Ozais joined GVSU just in August of 2020. So once again, we welcome you to our family and our campus. She earned her BA in English from Baker University, an MA in English, and an MSW from the University of Kansas, and a PhD in educational leadership and policy studies with an emphasis in higher education from the University of Oklahoma. Her research focuses on quality, equity, and higher education practice, especially investigating white women's racism and processes for creating educational spaces and curricula that resist racism and work toward real racial justice. She uses critical whiteness and effect theories to understand how college experiences support and resist white women's emotional and spatial investments in white supremacy. Dr. Ozais grew up in the rural Midwest in a family of teachers and farmers, and her background in social work informs her interest in community collaborations. Before joining the GVSU faculty, Dr. Ozais taught at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse Student Affairs Administration program, and she spent more than 15 years working in higher education administration at the University of Oklahoma and the University of Kansas. She is also appointed as the Director of Research and Scholarship for the ACPA. And Dr. William Washington was born and raised in Flint, and he is a Laker for a lifetime. Dr. Washington returned to become the TRIO Student Support Services Director. Dr. Washington studied at Grand Valley State University for both his undergraduate and graduate degrees, and then he went on to Eastern Michigan University for his PhD in educational leadership. Previously, he worked as a graduate assistant in housing and worked his way up to an assistant director of housing, so he certainly knows his way around campus. He believes in the 5 F's: faith, family, finances, friends, and fraternity, which is a reflection of his life. He is married with 3 children, one who is currently a Laker. He is a member of the Phi Beta Sigma fraternity. Dr. Washington is a flourishing entrepreneur and co-owner of a local fitness center, and he has goals of owning his own restaurant. Everything in his life reflects this motto, quote, "I am not successful until I help the next person be successful." His goals for TRIO are to increase retention, persistence, and graduation by supporting all students. Moreover, he has a special interest in African American male achievement. So I welcome all our panelists. The first part of our agenda is that each of them will share what the power of education means to them personally. And in the spirit of alphabetical approach, Dr. Benjamin, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you, Tim, and good morning, fellow panelists, and good morning, colleagues and friends, wherever you are, all over the state, all over the country. It's a pleasure to be here, and I mean that sincerely. When I started thinking about this, the power of education, the transformative power, I realized that I've actually been a teacher my entire adult life. You heard from Tim that I was a musician for a long time in Australia, and ask any jazz musician what it's like trying to make a living playing jazz for a living, and you'll find out it's very, very tenuous, very precarious. So of course, like all musicians, I took on students. So initially I was teaching, honestly, over the years, hundreds and hundreds of elementary school, middle school, high school students, how to play the flute, how to play the clarinet, the saxophone, composition, arranging, musicology. Probably the toughest teaching gig I've ever had was handing out 30 Yamaha plastic recorders to a second grade class and just trying to restore some sort of order before we could do anything. So that was probably, I think, still my toughest teaching assignment. So what I was teaching early on was technical skills, right? How to hold your mouth to make a particular shape, which fingerings will produce which notes and so on, how to breathe with your diaphragm. But I soon realized that in order to impart these technical skills, I needed to really communicate deeply with these students of all ages, literally from kindergarten through to retirees. So I sort of realized that communication is a critical part of this thing called teaching, whatever you're teaching, right? And have to be able to communicate effectively. I also was into outdoor pursuits, a lot of rock climbing and so on. And so I ended up teaching some outdoor pursuits at different like outward bound schools and so on in Australia. And there again, the communication is vital, because if one part of what you're saying is missed and a knot is not tied properly or a carabiner is not attached properly and so on, it's potentially very dangerous. So I learned early on I need to really communicate effectively and get people's attention, right? And then pass on these important messages. Then eventually I became a college professor more than 25 years ago. And in Australia, this meant teaching, again, technical skills. The Australian education system does not really embrace the liberal education, general education model. Most universities in Australia, this is true in Britain also, you get your degree in 3 years. There's no general education component. From day one, you're specializing in your field. You have the luxury of being able to choose one elective class per year of those 3 years. But apart from that, all you're really learning is political science or pre-vet or whatever it is, right? And so I just took this for granted because, again, all I taught was sort of technical skills. And then I came to Grand Valley and I became aware really for the first time of a liberal education and of what that means, and the general education component, which is not just forcing students to take a bunch of classes for whatever reason, but is really showing students the way exposing themselves to a wide range of knowledge and disciplines is really going to enrich their thinking and allow them to think much more broadly, even within their discipline. So if they are going to be a vet or a doctor or whatever, having studied some history and philosophy and literature and so on will make them much better doctors, much better vets and so on. So I became a passionate advocate for liberal education, and indeed ended up teaching a number of courses like Introduction to Liberal Education, Lib 100, and the honours version of that also, Lib Learn Lead, in which we would read many of the great readings written by people from Plato on to the present about what it means to be liberally educated, what an education truly is all about. And I became very passionate. I still get emails from colleagues in Australia saying, oh, you mean liberal education and all that rubbish, like dismissive of this approach. But I now realize that having taught at Grand Valley for 18 years and having kept in touch with my students over many years since graduation, often, that they all say my lives are much richer as a result of this broad education and the approach that Grand Valley sort of offered me. It really opens up possibilities in students' lives that they couldn't have imagined before. So you come in thinking, I'm going to be a finance major or whatever, right? And then you take a history class or you take a psychology class. And wow, just blew my mind. Actually, I think I want to do that. I want to apply my interest in science with psychology. I want to become a neuropsychologist. But they would never have had that opportunity, never have realized these possibilities if they hadn't been able to take this wide range of classes early on. So finally, I believe all the students that come into our classes have unlimited potential. This is true of students in the TRIO program with you, William, and certainly true of the very bright students I get to teach in the Honours College every day, right? They have unlimited potential. And it's up to us faculty to help them unlock that potential to see what their lives could be like. Um, in that way, I think we are very, very fortunate as educators. We get to touch the future every day, right? Through showing students just what they're capable of and helping them sort of look higher and think higher and more broadly about what their life's possibilities are. One last little anecdote. Early in the pandemic, back late March, I guess, I was walking through East Town where I live, and a jogger came the other way, and this was before we were wearing masks, and ran past me and then stopped and said, "Oh, you're a professor at Grand Valley, Professor Craig." No, Professor Benjamin. Said, "I was in your class in 2003. I said, "What?" I mean, that's a long time to remember. And he said, "No, I've never forgotten, because I came into that class as a first-year student. My whole world looked like this, right? That was my world, this little narrow, he made a little space like that. After a semester in a big history class, and then after my Grand Valley education in general, I realized the whole world was like this, right? There was no limit to my world, no limit to what I could do with my world." And I thought that is the finest sort of, I don't know, compliment, I guess, that any teacher could be paid. So they're my key points, right? Liberal education, unlimited potential. We want to expose students to what they're capable of. And then we send them out into the world. And through that, we touch the future every single day. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Dr. Benjamin. Dr. Ozais, what does it mean to you?
Yes, well, I think that's a great segue. I'm inspired, but also in large part because my experience is very similar to the student that Dr. Benjamin just talked about. I grew up, Tim, as you mentioned, in a rural area, a very small town in Kansas that was very white. I graduated from high school with 23 people, and only a handful of us went to college. So for me, a higher education in particular was what I knew at the time as a way out of being stuck in the place that I had grown up in the world. Um, but beyond that, what I learned my college education was about, and the power of that education for me, was this process of broadening my perspectives, of learning to see and understand the world from different points of view, and understanding that my own experiences were located not just in this big, culturally diverse world, but even more that my experiences as a white woman were shaped by unequal systems and institutions that often privileged me over others. So while I grew up in a really working class area and family, and that made college kind of unfamiliar to me and difficult to navigate at times, I do realize that the fact that I showed up as a white person also eased the way for me. And for those of you who read Tara Westover's book, Educated, I know some of you did. That's Tara Westover's experience too. That education was a ticket for her out of a very closed and violent situation in her family. But she was also learning histories that we either silenced or distorted for her as she was homeschooled. And I wasn't homeschooled. I public educated K through 12, but that was also my experience. There was a lot I didn't know about the world when I went to college. So that's part of the power of education for me. I did want to kind of propose something else for us to maybe think about as we're talking, which is I do think that there's a difference between education, so learning that broadens us and helps us to better understand perspectives other than our own, our positions, our place in the world, and schooling, which is the process of going to school. And I think sometimes schooling or going to school can be a broadening educational experience. And I think at other times, schooling can be harmful for students in different ways. So I think that's worth thinking about. I think schooling in the US context, anyway, can be harmful for students of color, for queer students, for poor students who don't see themselves represented in the curriculum, or who learn miseducations. Carter Woodson is a African American scholar from the early 20th century who talks about the miseducation, specifically for him of Black folks. So learning falsehoods about ourselves can be harmful if we're learning lies about history in school. And schooling can also be harmful for folks, particularly students with disabilities, students of color when they're suspended at higher rates, punished in school settings in ways that are harmful. So there's a very real way in which schooling can be harmful in that way. And then since I study whiteness and racism, I also think there's another way that schooling can be harmful. And I think schooling can be harmful for folks with privilege too, when it gives us a very narrow view of what literature or history or science is or what our profession is. So to think about being a doctor and maybe only learning what you need to know about disease without understanding human beings and the context of life that they're living in. So I think schooling can be harmful when it's very narrow too. And so that's why I went to a liberal arts college, so very much had a liberal arts education. But I've also taught at public institutions and been an administrator at public institutions. And so I think this general education, or this idea that our perspectives are broadened by participating in education, is really powerful. And I'm happy to talk more about racism. I saw there was a question that was submitted beforehand about kind of what can we do about racism. And I think the most important thing to do, but what I learned was not safe to do in my family, is to talk about race and racism. So in my family, it was impolite and to talk about race and racism. And I think that's common in a lot of white families. And so I think for me, the ability to be able to learn real histories of what racism looked like, understand my family's connection to histories of racism was really powerful. And I continue to do that learning as an adult. So I hope lifelong learning is something we all have to engage in to create a better world for ourselves and our neighbors. So that's part of how the power of education has been and is meaningful and important for me.
Thank you, Dr. Ozais. Really well said, well put together. And we move on to Dr. Washington. And after you conclude, I'll come back with a couple of general questions for us all.
Thank you and good morning. So I approach this power of education from a few different lenses. So I'll talk about culture, power, having a voice, and then figuring out what my grader was. I come from a very large family, extended. I was fortunate to have my biological father and my stepfather, 16 sisters and brothers, all in all, maybe close to 25 aunts. So out of this group, how many had a degree? Not many had degrees. In my immediate family, I was the first. I think about cultural piece, so the power of education. I had elders all over me, all around, that knew everything about everything and could give advice, but rarely had a formal education. Many of my family members didn't finish high school. Many of them migrated from the South up to the North to work in shops. Being in Flint and automotive industry was the bread and butter. But they always preached and always talked about, you can be better and you should be better than me. I'm doing this for you. So how are you going to follow my footsteps up to the point where you are an adult and make your own path? What's that going to look like? I think about power in education. So never will I advocate not doing skilled trades. I love skilled trades, and that's really what raised me, my family. But to have the alternative to choose your path, whether it be that skilled trades, whether it be education, liberal education for me provides the basis for problem solving systematically, being able to think through. I went through 5 majors at Grand Valley, all because I wanted to be greater or do something different. When I hit a wall, I just made another path. I walked around it, bust through it, or I did whatever I needed to do to get to where I wanted to be. I liken geometry to life. So we think about liberal education and geometry. People think, oh, well, I'm not going to use geometry unless I'm doing something in the sciences. For me, geometry taught me how to play pool in my basement with my family. It taught me how to be great at bank shots and things that simple. And so I liken some of the formal education to life's experiences and how you navigate some of those things. In my family, we talked a lot of mess to each other. So if I couldn't play pool, I'm really going to sit on the couch and just take it. I'm going to take all the verbal abuse and the jokes, that kind of thing. So I add that as an experience for me. My family could do anything from build a car to a multi-complex housing unit. And they all did it without a formal education. And so what they taught me was that you can do whatever you like. And for you to be better than me, if I can do this, imagine what you can do with that formal education behind it. Learn from me, take those matrices of education, whichever you choose to follow, and you be greater. So find out what your greater is. The other piece is voice. So oftentimes without education in this country, without a formal education, you don't have a voice. You don't have a voice for yourself. You can't advocate. And then you don't have the ability to question because people dismiss your conversation or your words because you aren't at my level, so to speak. So for me, that's another piece of liberal education. You don't actually have to have a particular skill. This liberal education offers you the ability to have dialogue, to discuss, to debate, convey your point within different circles. And then it also allows you to find your greater. What is your greater? For me, I'm still looking for it. I have a doctorate. I went for my terminal degree so I could have that voice. I did undergrad in public administration so I could work in the community. I did my master's in college student affairs leadership so I could work with college age students as I saw my daughter growing up. And so everything was for me being greater. And as excuse me. I'm sorry, I have a young 5 and 6 year old. So for me, and being the oldest of 7, I've always had people that looked at me, to me, for me, to be better. I'm always a person that answers questions. So in order to be that person for my family, for my friends, for my students, the power of education is important because someone's going to look up to you, whatever you're doing. And it can be formal, informal. But I feel like this liberal piece comes in different forms, not just the schooling, as my colleague spoke to, but education in general. And I think liberal education offers that support of whatever you'd like to do. So even if it's just basic classes at a community college, skilled trades, they offer formal piece that surrounds and encompasses what your passion might be and allows you that matrix to develop into what you want to be. So finding your greater. And lastly, for me, the power of education, it was coming from Flint, seeing all the things that I saw. I had a support group that I was very fortunate not to go into those different non-legal paths of life, no drug dealing, no gang banging, none of that stuff. And I had people that looked out for me because they saw the greater in me. And, go to school. We have this here. You go to school and do what you can do to be better. And I think that was probably the most prevalent for me in regards to the power of education. And I still revel in that support from family. And as we go and we grow older, I have several family members, cousins, siblings that have graduated from Grand Valley. And I'm an avid believer in what liberal education can do for a person in regards to that growth. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Washington. What struck me in the middle of your conversation that became a thread for Dr. Benjamin and Dr. Ozais is that notion of, as you said, striving for the greatness. And I think each of you has done a really great job in describing how liberal education has affected you and how it can positively affect individuals. I'd like to turn the question just maybe 45 degrees on its side and ask any one of you who would like to respond, what does the power or the outcome of a strong liberal education mean to society?
Well, I'll throw in just a couple of words. Dr. Washington mentioned students being able to think critically, think for themselves, and so on. Don't we want a society full of educated, informed, critical thinking, logical thinking students who are aware of all of the injustices in the world and all of the positives and negatives of their privilege, of their place in the world, and so on, so that they can make informed decisions politically, as consumers, in every way. I had a big discussion last week with one of my classes about fake news and deep fake news, and these are highly educated, very smart, honest students who are struggling to tell reality from non-reality in TikTok videos, for example. And the question was, half of me knows that Princess Diana wasn't murdered by some shadow or whatever, but look at these videos, Professor, they're so convincing. And of course, Michael Jackson died all those years ago, but I've seen photographs of him sitting in the back of a car just a few weeks ago. And these students are struggling to separate reality from all this deep fake stuff, which is online all the time. And so we had a long talk about developing your critical thinking filter. Like, what do you subject these videos to? How do you process them? How do you think about them? What's your where does your sort of healthy skepticism kick in, and so on? I think it's going to be more and more difficult for students and people in the future to deal with this, onslaught, assault of sort of false information, false news. So for me, being able to think really critically and deeply evaluate what you're seeing, right, and subject it to this critical thinking filter, which is, as you said, William, is at the heart of liberal education, is crucial for society in the future.
Okay, hearing no other immediate thoughts. There's been a thread running through some of the questions, and so I'll sort of summarize it this way. What does the power of education, and obviously in Grand Valley's case, what does the power of liberal education mean to first generation college students and graduates?
I'll try to tackle that one first. So for me, and first and foremost, I think it means it provides an escape. Many of our first-gen students are in a place where they want to be better. Some home situations aren't the best, and a lot of students are using it as an escape. So this is a way for me to become better. It may be a way for me to leave and come back and help family. I might have family responsibilities, and I need to be in a better place because I can't do it as I am. So I think of it as an escape. We often think of education equaling better income or more income. We know the fact that you can easily become a billionaire with a great idea and not going to school, but for most of us, normal folk, don't have that creativeness. Education is that tool. And so I think the most prevalent piece is that escape, and I want to be better. So that's the students trying to find their greatness. How am I going to be better? How am I going to affect change? And I think that happens through education. Oftentimes you get the tools that you might need to be better at the institution that you're going to. So some students may choose a program or a school that's going to provide me a laptop, that's going to help me with books, or give that, this whole notion behind scholarships and grants. I want to go where I get the most money, where I can go to school for free and not have to come out with debt. Some students understand that. But being the first generation students and not knowing what you don't know often puts them in situations where they have to shuffle around a little bit before they find what's best for them or their home. Hence, we have a lot of students transferring from community colleges because they use that opportunity to see where I want to be or understand what I want to be, find my niche for the most part, and then move on to the next. So it's layers for first generation students. It's a problem solving puzzle for them to figure out where they want to be, where they need to be, and where they can fit in to be the best that they can be. And for many, it's not college, because some just go into working because they have to support family or take care of themselves. And so they miss the opportunity and choose other venues. But I think the education piece for us and for most first gen is really an escape to be better, an attempt to find, what their grade is.
I just add that I've had a lot of first generation students in the Honors College. Most of them have come from small rural towns in Michigan. Most of them had a very narrow view of the world, an understanding of the world and of their possible future. And they're sitting in a class with me and a bunch of other students learning about Confucian philosophy or the construction of the Mongol Empire. And you just see their minds getting, wow, like who knew the world was out there, and that, you know, I could travel all over this world and find all sorts of possibilities for myself in this world. Possibilities that just never occurred to me when I was at home with my family in sort of local rural high school and so on. I love to see that. I teach courses that last the whole year, whole of the first year. So I've got the same group of 25 students in each class from end of August through to the end of April. And just to see their minds expanding and the possibilities that open for them expanding every day is incredibly rewarding. Even more so with first gen students, I think, than students who come from already, you know, professional, highly educated families.
That was certainly the power for me. I think when I think about first generation students and the power of education, I think about all the barriers that we create that are unnecessary. You know, there's a lot of expectations when folks, whether it's community college or a four-year institution, when folks, you know, how do you enroll? How do you finance an education? Because the ticket price is so high these days. You know, nobody could look at that ticket price, or very few folks anyway, can look at that ticket price and think that they could afford that without knowing anything about financial aid and things like that. So I think about the barriers and the puzzle pieces that have to fall into place um, for folks to get access. I also am thinking about learning at any age, and folks going back to school after having started in the workforce because you had to make a living, to support your family, whatever that family looked like. I hope, and I know Grand Valley, this is a goal and a focus for the future, and I really hope it comes to fruition, that there are more and more opportunities at Grand Valley and in the Grand Rapids area, West Michigan area, for folks to engage in additional education, higher education, liberal education, you know, at lots of different points in the lifespan. Come back to get a graduate degree, or come back after having taken a couple of classes at community college and then needing, you know, to work. Um, but also, I'm really interested in um, how education might be supported in spaces that aren't higher education institutions. So, how can public libraries and museums and faith communities be places where folks are getting a liberal education too? You know, without having to pay tuition or get credits. So, Dr. Washington, you know, talking about learning from family who may not have a formal education, but certainly have a lot of education and a lot of learning to share. So, those are some of the challenges before us that I think about when I think about just the unnecessary barriers, but all of the opportunities for folks who might be first generation college students.
Thank you. I want to stick with that thought just for 1 second, and then we'll kind of catch up to a couple of question threads we haven't raised yet. But Dr. Ozais and Dr. Benjamin, Dr. Washington, there's been a couple of questions that really take off on what you just said, and I might sort of rephrase them this way. If anyone said to each of you, you know, I'm early or mid-career and I'm thinking about going back to continue my education or to finish a degree that I did not complete, what's in it for me as someone who's non-traditional age, who's seriously contemplating going back for my liberal arts degree? So how would you answer those folks?
Well, I can tell you, Tim, I've had, when I used to teach in the history department full time, before I moved into the Honors College, I had a lot of military veterans that were coming to university after having served in the military in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they were coming back generally with some specific, more vocationally focused degree in mind. Like a lot of them I remember were business majors. and they could see themselves, as entrepreneurs and businessmen in the future, businessmen and women. But of course, they had to take a history class because it's part of the general education component and so on. And initially they'd say, what am I doing learning about the history of, ancient Mesopotamia? I've just been over there fighting a war. I don't need to know about what happened 5,000 years ago. And so then we'd have really intense discussions in the class. I think Dr. Washington and Dr. as just mentioned, this discussion is a crucial component of a good liberal education. And you'd have a bunch of 18, 19-year-olds in there with a very limited view of the world, trying to explain to this maybe 33, 34-year-old veteran, right, who served in the military, why this is important. I actually didn't have to do much myself at all in the end. They'd say, because you've experienced a lot in your life, but there's a lot you don't know yet, right? And you're going to learn through this history class stuff that will come back and be beneficial to you in ways you can't even imagine right now, well into the future, as a businessman, as whatever it is you're going to do. So I didn't need to make the case because the students themselves were already saying, I'm only taking this history class because I have to, but already I'm seeing that some of the insights I'm gaining into the way our world works, right? The way it worked thousands of years ago is still much the way it works today. And so this is going to give me really important information to help construct my own life, my own future. So that's about the only experience I've had with, but I'd make the same arguments we've all been making. You want to learn to think well, you want to learn to write well, to be eloquent and articulate in conversation, to use evidence to support an argument. These are all the skills of a liberal education. So you can speak with anybody and feel comfortable speaking with anybody. And you can read all the science of the world and make sense of it. Your life will be much richer as a result. So that's the sort of argument I'd try and make.
And I'd concur, Dr. Benjamin. I would also impress upon that person in conversation in regards to why. It has to be a reason. So either someone's telling you to do it, you want to make more money in your current position, you're maybe looking at different careers or a different career path. And so I would have to make sure that that person is able to articulate the why they want to go back. And again, is what's their greater? And I'm gonna stick on that. What is the motivation? Because if it's just to appease the majority, white people, or is it to appease a peer group, you're not going to, the passion's not going to be there. And so we can talk about all the educational components and the dialogues and being able to debate, critical thinking, but it's going to have to be something that person wants and for a reason. So I would help that student. You could do vision boards. There are lot of different ways to help students or any adult think about where they want to be and what the end goal is. And so the passion is where I would try and help that person focus on the why. Why do you want to come back? Because we can make an educated argument in terms of the benefits of it. But again, we all like sugar, but it's not good for us, kind of thing. So.
Very good, thank you. Again, I'm going to distill down sort of a thread of questions, and perhaps one of the best ways it's been stated so far is from an O2 grad, a Master in Education, who puts the question this way: how do you view the power of education as an equalizer against the cultural, economic, and other inequalities of society today? I know it's a huge question. I know we're 2/3 of the way through, but it's definitely one to tackle. So I pose it to you all.
If I can attempt to answer first. So I have a friend on the call, and he posed a quote or some thoughts from Carter G. Woodson about the present system under the control of the white trains the Negro to be white, and at the same time convinces him of the impropriety or impossibility of his becoming white. And I would say, again, I'm looking for the passion, but you find your why and do it because you want to. So in our society and what we're going through now, this equality, we have all the hot mess, with politics, Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter. We have to have students and people in general understand how to discern between good and bad, correct information versus the fake news, like Dr. Benjamin talked about. and make steps to either further themselves in order to further the society. And I think that is where the equality comes in, because as long as we're trying to be the other person as a group, we're not going to be able to be ourselves. We have a multitude of different ethnicities, cultural backgrounds, disenfranchised groups in this country that if all had an equal path, I think we would definitely be the greatest country in the world. So we talk about dialogue, being able to understand each other's cultures. We think about different cultures and how they problem solve versus how we problem solve, violence versus dialogue, sitting at the table, communing over just generalities and understanding and learning. I think it brings us to a level of equality, and then that becomes economic equality, because we are then so I think back into just fair trade before dollars and cents came in. You give me corn, I give you a turkey. I think that's how it should show up. Now, granted, I'm being idealistic here, but when we're all at the table sharing common thoughts and we see the commonalities between us, and there is no power level being enforced, I think we get to a place where we all can elevate. And unless and until we stop trying to be like the others, or stop trying to be like Jane and John and Bill, and be ourselves and bring our voice to the table, I think we're going to continue to do that. So I think this level of education allows more people to be that and be that support. Everyone's going to play a role. We all can't be doctors. We all can't be president. We're going to find the best us and be that. And I think that's where we start chipping away at this economic inequality, and our culture's flourishing. You know, I go into some communities. I lived in Chicago for a long time. Cross the street and you're in this community. Go around the block, you're in this community. And it was baffling, but it was beautiful at the same time. Like, why the self borders? But then when I see them on campus at UIC, or where I was at, the dialogues and the cultural interactions were beautiful. And it shed a light on how the greater community would be if we embraced it versus fragment it and, piece it out.
I would just follow up on that to say 100%. That's, I think, what we can and should be working toward. And I think when we see borders between communities and between people, um, I would argue it's always a product, at least in terms of race and culture, that it's a product of white supremacy. So it's a product of white people in particular, hoarding resources. And I say that as a white person and seeing, um, how this has worked for folks that I've seen. And I think part of the way that happens in higher education is, we see access to education being, gates being closed and kind of gatekeeping being done, based on things like test scores, high school GPA. Certainly, the cost of an education is prohibitive for a lot of people, and that ends up controlling who does and doesn't have access then to this opportunity that can create, um, you know, greater financial freedom, as well as other kinds of access to having voice in certain spaces of power in the world. And so I appreciate this quote from Carter Woodson too. That's in the chat. I think the challenge is that a lot of white folks need to learn to be comfortable sharing space, giving up some power in order to share power with folks of color in the world. And that's something that I think about a lot in research in terms of white women. White women have played, specifically around schooling. There's a really good book called Mothers of Mass Resistance, and it's a bit of a trick of a title because it's about how white women, mothers in particular, picketed the streets in the South in the 60s, advocating that segregation be maintained. So they were using their power to insist that their children not have to go to school with children of color. And I know it's a painful history and a hard one to think about, but I think there are still ways in which white folks, support processes that we say are based on merit, but how we define merit and rigor is actually based on racism. It's quite well documented that standardized tests benefit white folks and middle class folks above folks of color and poor and working class folks. Um, so I think I can speak for white folks. I think Carter Woodson, of course, is speaking for the experiences of Black folks in the U.S. in schools. So this experience where you're told you have to be white because that's what success looks like. Meanwhile, you can quote act white, which we can talk about how false that idea is, but you'll never actually be accepted into places of power because of racism. And so I think white folks have a lot of work to do to remake schools and give up space, share space, and share power so that our schools are healthier, safer, better places for all students to learn.
Just follow up very briefly, but that reminded me, I was living in the UK in 2016 on sabbatical leave, just after the Brexit vote had been taken. And a lot of what was behind the Brexit vote in the UK was the large number of immigrants that had come. And these were not immigrants of color, these were other white immigrants, right? From Poland in particular, to come and live in these small rural towns in Britain. And so I was living in this town. I'd go for a walk every single morning, small town out in the eastern side of Britain near Cambridge. And I would see the Polish mothers outside the elementary school, Polish mothers, the Portuguese mothers, and the English mothers, all standing in their own groups, talking to each other, right? Outside. There was no interaction between these three European groups. I mean, the barrier was not just color, but the minute all their kids ran through the gates into the school playground, they were all intermixing and playing and hanging out together and having a great time. So I thought, if this generation can just keep going, right? If they can just keep working together like this, a lot of the racial resentment that drove the Brexit decision and so many other racial problems in the world will not disappear, but will be reduced through the power of education. Right? It was actually very disappointing on the one hand, being outside the school grounds, but then very heartening when I watched all the kids run in and start mixing together once they're in the school ground. So yeah, just a reminder, Dr. Ozais, as you know, of course, it's not always just white and color. It's even between white groups, there are these rigid barriers and anyway, yeah, just wanted to share that little anecdote.
Again, thank you. And, as all too often happens in instances like these, the hour is racing by all too quickly. So before we get to kind of the concluding few moments, I did want to give each of you the opportunity, take a minute or two, perhaps at the most, to reflect a bit on the notion of COVID, the pandemic, and forced distance / Zoom learning. Dr. Ozais, in the middle of your comments a minute ago, I jotted down, you said borders in education, and what's perhaps more symbolic of a border in education than where we are. So you all have had intense experiences. So maybe share for a moment, understanding that we've got a plethora of students and faculty and alum on the call. So let them know what you felt.
Who wants to go first? I can say very briefly. Firstly, thank you to Elizabeth Tamaro, who's on this call, who wrote a nice shout out to me about a class she took with me many years ago now. But thank you for that. I was very dubious about switching to online learning, and I had planned to teach in-person hybrid until literally the last weekend before the fall semester began. And it was that weekend I decided to switch to fully online. I'd taken some classes during the summer about online teaching, and I felt equipped to do so. I divided my classes into groups of 10. I put all the lecture material online for students to access in their own time. And we used a 75-minute classroom for intense discussion, just 11 faces there on the screen using this magic tool of Zoom. And the classes have worked out much, much better than I thought they would. We're able to, everyone keeps their camera on, everyone keeps their microphone on, and we have intense, spontaneous conversation, almost as we would have done in the classroom. So I've actually become a real convert to online teaching with Zoom, and I'm looking forward to continuing to do so in the future. Of course, I do miss being in the classroom with my students, if I'm honest.
Go ahead.
So my last thoughts. So COVID has made us go to a virtual platform for most universities. Prior to this, it wasn't a practice that was broadly thought positively of. So we had these virtual schools, not accredited, and people were like, well, that's not real education because you don't have the face-to-face conversations. And now that the majority has been forced to go virtual and create these practices, I think it's leveling some of the playing field in terms of access.
Mm-hmm.
Now the challenge then becomes the tools to have access for especially for my students, first gen trio students. How do we get them the access? Because many of them are at home with 5 or 6 people using the internet or sharing a computer, might have a tablet, students doing homework on their phones, things of that nature. So although it potentially could level access and reach populations that we haven't traditionally reached with our normal curriculum in universities and colleges, I think the next challenge is how do we make sure the resources are out there for those students to have access.
Yeah.
And it could mean the world for students, those with disabilities that can't physically get places. For those that don't have the resources, we have several states who are divvying up power to houses to get through the storm. And these are factors as we keep going, we're going to have a new barrier every year. And this ingenuity that we've come across because of COVID is going to pose challenges as well as opportunities for a lot. And we need to be ready to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to take advantage of those opportunities as they come.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to, I can't add anything more. I think that's key. How can we use this to keep increasing access rather than creating more barriers to keep folks out of having these educational experiences?
And before I go into the sort of summary question, I did want to mention that there have been a few comments in the chat applauding the panelists and applauding Grand Valley for everything that the university is doing and how each of you is sort of demonstrating and symbolizing our openness to education, our vision for the future of education, and our vision for equality in education. So just to recapitulate some of those comments and to thank each of you. And also I'm going to sort of dangle a question that perhaps one of the alumni relations staff might want to type into the chat. And as I'm very almost off script, they're probably going crazy, but I know that the alumni relations staff feels that this event and others like this demonstrate that this ongoing education, especially in this format, is what they've characterized as a very homegrown effort that we're undertaking, that we're not reaching elsewhere to bring experts in to tackle these topics. So I just wanted to mention that, and again, provide the opportunity for the staff to say anything they'd like to in the chat about this homegrown effort that we've undertaken. That said, the sort of final question, we'll jump off on something Dr. Washington alluded to, and that he told all of us in a pre-meeting of a couple of weeks ago, which is that availability and access and opportunity. And with 5 minutes to go, I would like each of you to answer this question. Again, knowing that we've got faculty and alum and students listening in, what can each of us do, especially the alumni? What can we do to help you as educators and to help the broader university community keep advancing the power of a liberal arts education?
Tim, I'd like to join in thanking Chris and Courtney, by the way, for organizing this from Alumni Relations. Thank you. And all the alumni out there, everything you're doing to support our students, particularly our first generation students and students from disadvantaged backgrounds and so on, is so appreciated. There are so many scholarships at Grand Valley, and I know many of the students I teach in the Honours College have been able to access, a range of scholarships, but we can't do enough to support these students. And several times we've mentioned the challenges of financing a degree. So even my students from good middle-class families are adding up all the time what their debt's going to be by the end of this. And it's sort of weighing on them even as first-year students. So the more we can do to help them financially and in every way to support our students, particularly those who are most deserving of our support in terms of their, social backgrounds and so on. And actually, Dr. Ozais, I think you're an inspirational figure for this. And I'm going to share your story with some of my students this afternoon, first generation students from rural sort of towns and not particularly well-off backgrounds and so on, gaining a high-level degree. So I just want to thank the alumni for all of their help and support of our current students. They appreciate it, and so do we faculty appreciate it.
Go ahead.
I was going to defer to you.
I would say, alumni, faculty, staff, students, for those that have attended Grand Valley, I would impress upon you to remember your days at Grand Valley. Kisser, Copeland, Robinson, those struggles that we all had as students, getting to class, walking in the snow. We complain about not having snow days. Now we close for almost anything. But think about the challenges of students who can't get to where they need to get, who don't have the resources or can't afford that laptop. There are a plethora of opportunities for you to give financially at the university. My program, our TRIO program, has a high impact fund that I use to support students for purchasing books when financial aid is kind of run out. There are other first gen opportunities. And if you look at the development page, you can pick and choose where you give. If you don't want to give to a general fund, find a specific fund and give. If you can't, be physical. I would say and challenge alumni to reach out to the university, different departments, maybe your program that you graduated from, offer to become a speaker or offer to be a mentor for someone. These students need to see more people like themselves, one, and they need to know that there's been people that's traveled this path before, and they might have questions that they may not be able to get at home because being first generation students, they don't have a place to get feedback from. Hey, mom, I don't understand. I can't help you. Is there someone at school that can help you? We are always short-staffed when it comes to advising students and helping students. There's never enough voices for a student to help them kind of walk this path of the education at Grand Valley. So I would get engaged, please. Find a student, engage with the university somehow. If you can't, you can help financially, but I can tell you, many students would love to hear your voice and your experience and kind of pick your brain.
Mm-hmm.
Again, thank you all very much. As we conclude, Courtney's popping up opportunities in the chat that you might want to remember and take advantage of. And I think, not to pick out anyone in particular, but way back at the beginning, when Dr. Benjamin was going through his initial comments, I wrote down one phrase, and I'm just going to wrap us up saying, echoing his words, we all have the opportunity to touch the future every day. So again, thank you, panelists, for showing us how we can touch the future. Thank you for explaining how you touch the future. Thank you to the alumni relations staff, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a great day.